What is up, everyone? Ryan Ray here inside the War Room. And guess what? Special news. We're back on YouTube. And so we took a little hiatus, but more and more of our episodes will be back. Not all of them, but we are going to start putting more of them back on there. Okay. So you can find that at warroommedia.com. I'll link to that in the show notes, which are at where? RyanRaySenior.com. Okay, so today we have on a pretty popular YouTuber. Goes by the name of on YouTube as Destiny, but that's not his actual name, of course. His name is Steven. And so he streams pretty much every day. He talks politics and from a progressive standpoint, but he has on a lot of debates with conservatives and right wingers. And he's pretty critical of, I think, all sides. And so it's worth checking out his stuff. I enjoy it. And so, anyways, I'm gonna link to all of that in the show notes. But let's get to my talk with Steven slash Destiny. Well, Steven, welcome to the War Room. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's get into it. You, I think, are one of the more fascinating people that I've come across, at least in the online sector. You've carved out a pretty good niche for yourself, where you kind of have these debates and you kind of are live streaming all the time. I'm just curious, what kind of got you into the live streaming, political genre and gaming space?
Started streaming 12 years ago, originally as a StarCraft 2 player, then was kind of like a semi-professional StarCraft 2 player, then just played a bunch of games. And then around 2016 with Trump, me and along with half the internet decided to jump into politics more full-time, I guess.
And did you find that when you jumped into the political realm, did you grow your audience? Did you lose some of your audience? Was it controversial or did your audience kind of already know where you sat politically?
They'd already kind of known. We'd talk about a lot of different things on stream. Even when we were playing games, we'd talk about a lot of different things, a lot of different topics. So it wasn't like a big mystery where I stood on most things.
Yeah. And going back to what about Trump made you want to jump into politics?
I just saw that like around the time that Trump started running, it seemed like all of the conversations politically were getting really, really bad everywhere. Like there was a lot of factual disconnect between both sides. So I thought I could join and do a little bit better.
And I'm guessing that was from an anti-Trump perspective. Is that correct?
Mainly from an anti-Trump perspective, but there are a lot of things that the left gets wrong as well. So
Yeah. So for me, one of the things that I've kind of observed was Trump running kind of pulled the curtain back, if you will, of maybe the nastiness that's kind of all around there from all sides, and it was kind of a mirror into um, maybe what you would see from the political elite or the corporate media, if you will.
mhm.
They're kind of able to play this game, and then Trump, for better or worse, was able to kind of pull that back and kind of show that there's just a lot more nasty people than maybe most folks realized.
Maybe, yeah. It's one way
No,
to look at it. Yeah.
disagree.
I think that we all kind of saw that there was a little bit more in the United States in terms of capacity for certain types of thought or certain types of attacks or certain types of political ideas. I think when Trump ran, for sure.
So, I'm curious. So, would you say that you said you don't necessarily just agree with that? So, I think during the so I'm 30 for your perspective. The audience knows I'm 37,
Mhm.
and so from my perspective, I always kind of felt like the right wing media would kind of bow to the right wing candidate, the left wing media would kind of bow to the left wing candidate, and then when Trump comes along, it seemed like the the what you call, I guess, the left wing media, if you will, really started examining things for the first time in my life to a degree they hadn't before. Like they didn't really examine the Iraq War stuff on a deep level. A lot of the Obama stuff was kind of swept under the rug, and so now now all of a sudden everything that Trump did was really analyzed, and to the point of silliness. And the right wing media obviously kind of played the role that they have historically played, but it seemed to push them a little bit more. I don't know if unprofessional is not the word, but the antics that they would use kind of mirrored on some of what Trump was doing. That'd be more of what I'm saying.
Maybe. I mean, I think there's always been a lot of pedantry, a lot of silliness. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for. You've got like Trump, Fox News covering segments of Obama wearing like a gray suit or using Dijon mustard, or you could say that like Democrats were witch hunting Trump over stuff related to Ukraine or January 6th. But then on the Republican side of things, you've got Benghazi and Hillary's emails, and yeah, I don't know. I think politics has always been like a pretty nasty game, but I think we're getting into more unique times in human history with social media to where all of us are super plugged in, super engaged, and are expected to have an opinion on everything and can, express an opinion on everything to the entire world. So the political engagement is starting to feel a bit different.
It's funny because one of you brought up the type of suits Obama wore, and I remember I don't know who it was, but they were like, "Oh, President Obama didn't wear a suit into the Oval Office, and you always wear a suit into the Oval Office." And it's like, well, okay, if North Korea is sending a nuclear weapon, do you want him to put the suit on at
Mhm.
2 a.m., go down there? And so there definitely has been a sense of silliness. Historically, but you talk about moving everyone's in the discussion now. I'm always torn. What percentage of Americans do you actually think are engaged in the political conversation? Because it's online, you can definitely find crowds that are super tuned in, and you can find crowds that are kind of oblivious to it. So, is it really that more people are tuned in, or is it just that you can find those people now?
I think more people are tuned in. I think these social media platforms are growing at huge rates. It was Facebook initially, now it's Twitter, TikTok. So I think there are more people plugged in. It's a mistake to think that 95% of the American population is on Twitter, of course. I'm sure it's probably, I don't know if it would be less than half actually at this point. I'm sure the numbers aren't as big as some people might think, but not only are the social media platforms growing, I think people in real life are expected to have political opinions on everything. We're starting to feel that way in a lot of areas. Like everybody's supposed to have an opinion about Leah Thomas. Everybody's supposed to have an opinion about the Ukraine war. Everybody's supposed to have like strong opinions about everything, even if you don't really know what's going on. So yeah, I think even if we're not at a point where 98% of Americans are plugged into Twitter, tweeting constantly about whatever Pelosi or Trump is saying, it feels like it's trending in that direction.
So you do a lot of debates and cover a lot of ground. I was watching the other day that you had a stream where I think you talked about schizophrenia. You cover a lot of ground. So how do you balance having an informed opinion over all these things and maybe staying away from topics that you don't know about, or do you kind of say everything's free, open game, and I'm gonna talk about whatever I feel like? How do you balance that?
I think everything's open game. I'll usually, I get emails from people that, so you mentioned the schizophrenic thing. A couple of things related to schizophrenia had come up, I think, a couple weeks ago. And I had a few people email me who said they're either schizophrenic or schizoaffective. And they wanted to come on and chat about their experience. I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. So, yeah, whatever people want to talk about. If it's interesting to me, then yeah, we'll have them come on and we'll chat.
And do you consider yourself as a naturally curious person?
Yeah, for sure. It's probably one of my biggest strengths for doing like this type of content is I'll sit and read a study or a Wikipedia article or a news article or some huge profile for an hour or two on stream, and I'll kind of learn something from it.
Yeah, so I am curious about that. You talk about doing stuff on stream. You're usually gaming during streaming. You're probably gaming right now, if I had to
No, I'm
guess.
not right now. If I have been, but no.
How do you balance being tuned into these conversations while gaming?
Usually, if it's a certain type of debate, it's probably going to be an argument tree that I've ran down a million times before, so I don't really have to think much about it. I just kind of say whatever. If it's a challenging conversation and you watch me, or I shouldn't say whatever. I know the proper response to everything. If it's a challenging conversation though, and you watch me play a game in the background, usually if you watch me playing the game, I'm just like running around in circles because I'm like trying to focus a lot on the conversation. So yeah, I can't like play a complicated game and dedicate my mind to that and like dedicate my mind to a really complicated conversation at the same time. It's just not possible.
What value do you define it? Do you find in debating?
Um, there is what is the value of debating and what value do I find in debating? So I like debating because I like the idea of there's this concept called commensurability, right? If I'm trying to add 3/5 and like 1/10 together, I can't do that. I have to find a way to make the denominators the same. And in making those two things commensurate, they can be talked about and compared and analyzed. I don't like video essays. Well, I shouldn't say I don't like them. They have their place. Video essays and all these things where you are on your own because you can talk about the issues that you want. But I like debating people, arguing with because I have a set of beliefs. They have a set of beliefs, and we need to find a way to make it so we can communicate to each other despite our differences in beliefs and find some sort of like common or middle ground. And that idea of commensurability, I think, is like the hallmark or the cornerstone of a functioning democracy. I think more and more today, in some ways, people keep saying that we're becoming more people on the right will say we're too diverse, it's falling apart because of this. We're actually becoming unbelievably homogenous, just in two different groups, where the ideologies of this tribe and of this tribe are there. Like you have to match up on almost every single idea in order to be accepted into these groups. And it seems like we're all getting like more different or whatever because you see these two groups. But if you look at just the two groups in isolation, you can see that there's this ideological purity that I don't know if there ever was there before because we can enforce it via these really strict internet things. So yeah, I like the idea of debate because you can pull people out of their circles and then you argue with them and they're forced to kind of consider another person's idea instead of the caricature of that person that they'll probably see in their own group.
Have you ever had your mind change not from listening to a debate, but by participating in a debate?
Yeah, for sure. There are really intelligent people I've argued with that I've had like my mind shifted on different topics over the years. Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the things when I've watched debates is a lot of times it's as if the two debaters aren't actually listening to each other, as you mentioned. Most of the time, if they're good debaters, they've researched, they know what's coming, they know the arguments, where it's going, and so they're more trying to counteract what's being said than
Mhm.
actually listening. So, what does it take to persuade you in a debate?
I'm I like facts and figures. So if you can show me that my argument is factually incorrect, or if you can show it's deductively incorrect, like I'll probably change my mind. It might not happen like immediately because all of us have egos. All of us can be pretty
Sure.
heated in a debate. But like, yeah, if somebody challenges a position I have, I don't have a good response. Usually over time, I'll probably start to shift on it, or I'll do more research for my position.
Yeah, and so are you looking to do more larger scale? I mean, you obviously have a pretty good YouTube following, but are you open to doing like more larger in person debates, maybe at colleges and stuff like
Mhm.
that, or do you kind of like the confined? I don't say confined, but the internet environment where it's just kind of
I
no background noise, if you will.
Yeah, I like live events a lot. Actually, I think the energy is a lot different. I like to be able to see a person in front of me. I've been doing more of those. Those have been ramping up a lot over the past year. I was just in New York City for an event. I've gone to a few colleges, several colleges, I think, over the past year. Yeah, any of these types of live conversations, I think, are really good. So, looking to do more of those.
And is your read that these colleges and universities are open to having debates, or kind of the perception that you're going to get people tromping in and hollering and yelling and shutting down debates? What's been your experience?
So far, they've been pretty open to it, but we'll see. And if I do a really big one, maybe that'll change. Yeah.
And so you debate topics that you disagree with, and so I think part of the process you're talking about earlier that should be considered is that if you, considered a debater or subject matter expert on one side, is willing to engage with someone else, at least there's a sense in which you're not endorsing the position, but it's a position that the public should hear as a debater. And it feels like we've kind of lost that. If someone's willing to debate someone, then at least half of the debate team is saying that this other side should be heard. And I don't know why that's a controversial opinion in 2022. Is it because of the split that you mentioned, or is it because everyone's got a voice now? And
There's People have built a lot of dumb reasons why certain ideologies can't be heard, and we've kind of moved into this area where the idea is that like just hearing something or learning about something is intrinsically harmful. So on the left, they might say that if we allow certain types of speech to be pervasive across college campuses, it'll turn people into Nazis or fascists. On the right, you've got people saying that if we teach CRT or if we have trans people in certain areas, it's going to cause people to groom kids or it's going to cause people to hate America. So yeah, people have gotten, it's kind of weird because maybe it's always been like this, or maybe it did change. But I felt like 20 years ago, there was even 20 years ago, I'm only 33, but it felt like there was this kind of an attachment to like the idea of freedom of speech and the marketplace of ideas. And we live in a democracy. We're not always going to agree. I might not agree with what you have to say, but I'll die for your right to say it, et cetera, et cetera. That was kind of like the line of thought. But nowadays, it feels like both sides are pushing very hard on this. Like, if we allow the other side to have the speech they want, it's going to destroy the fabric of our country. So, yeah.
yeah, and I think one of the things that I've thought about on that is the speech that you're concerned about, not you, but people
Mhm.
generally, is speech that is in a power context. So, for instance, my neighbor next door at his house saying whatever he says, it doesn't impact my life one way or another. He's doing his thing, I'm doing my thing. However, the speech that's giving at a local town hall meeting or in front of millions of people, now all of a sudden you might persuade minds. And so it seems like the speech that people are actually concerned about is the speech that could persuade other people. So, right.
Sure, but I mean that's all speech, right? I mean you got to allow that's kind of part of our buy-in to a democracy. You have to be able to let people speak. And if you're so worried that somebody else's speech is going to be so attractive to somebody or it's going to turn minds a lot, I think that says a little bit more about your position than theirs. Like, and that's kind of the issue that I've had with a lot of people on the left. Are you so unconfident in your platform that as soon as somebody hears something else, they're going to magically turn into a Republican or a Nazi or a fascist? Like that seems to be pretty sad. If that's the case, your position seems either untenable or just unsustainable.
Oh, no, I agree with you. I'm just saying that I think that the speech is actually tied to, it's tied to power. Like,
Mhm.
it's not that people are concerned about speech per se, it's speech that could persuade minds.
Maybe
And
sure.
so
Yeah.
yeah, and so if you look at, like, the whole deplatforming thing, it seems that the deplatforming is more tied to, well, this person's getting a voice now, therefore they might sway people. But, if someone's at their house, I don't think people actually care what they're saying, in the confines of their home or in a small circle of friends. It's more tied to the power dynamic at large, which is
Mhm.
why, you see someone like, Alex Jones or, Alex, who's the Alex Berenson, something like that. That they amass a large following. They talk about controversial things. People are concerned, and so they move for the deplatform there. Whether or not at the House, if you think of if you agree with what Jones says or not, seems to be a lot
Mhm.
less.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned on the left that you kind of push back that people might be Nazis or fascists. Is that a? I mean, do you what percentage of the Republican Party would you say would fall into this Nazi fascist camp?
Nazism very low. Fascism, depending how you define it, I think there's a lot of troubling currents of thought right now in the Republican Party that need to be excised. Um, one
Like,
thing that really scares me is the attacking of the institution of the media seemed to be very pervasive under Trump, and then the institution of our electoral process. Those are two really important institutions for democracy, and attempting to undermine or circumvent or attack those, I think, is a really troubling sign. I think that should be very worrying to everybody. When Trump is saying things like, I want to open up libel laws to sue the media as I'm the president to keep them from publishing stories about me that I don't like, or when you're trying to say that, like, I think the election is faked, and even if you go through all the processes, it seems like that wasn't the case. To continue to harp on that, those are two scary things that you wouldn't want any leader kind of pushing into. But
yeah. So you have Trump. What percentage of the Trump or the Republican Party do you think goes along with that? You think that's a majority, or you
um,
think it's a minority?
I thought it was over 50% for the I'd have to go and look it up. I thought it was like 50 or 60% of Republicans still thought that the election could have been stolen.
Yeah.
I just checked. I'm sorry. I always check real quick. In June,
No,
on
go.
poll after poll, about 70% of Republicans say they don't think Joe Biden is the legitimate winner of 2020, of the 2020 election. I don't know if that means they think that the election was actually rigged or if they thought that some foul play happened somewhere else, but yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, the election fraud thing has been something of interest. Not of interest, but just the narrative around it. Because from my perspective, I was in D.C. the night of the election. I went on this cross country tour, going to
Mhm.
visit all these cities, and so I went to bed at like 1 a.m. D.C. time. I thought Biden had won that night. That was based upon what I do on the presidential elections. Is I'll follow the local reporters on Twitter,
Mhm.
see what they're saying is going to happen in their counties because they have a pretty good read on it.
Mhm.
And so, kind of reading what they're saying is like, okay, it looks like he's probably going to take this thing. That was election night.
Mhm.
It turned to be right. Now, as it moves forward, to me, it was a weird debate because Trump started saying, well, there's election fraud. It's like, well, right, there's always election fraud on substance. Like, even if it's small, there's some fraud that happens. That's not really a debatable point. It's what level did it happen to? And it felt like we kind of lost the argument from the get go, which is no, this election was great. To oh, this was taken. It's like I don't know. It seems like probably some votes were faked, but was there enough to change the election? I haven't seen any evidence for that.
Mhm.
Um, but it seemed like you couldn't be right there in the middle, which is yeah, there's always election fraud, but probably not enough to overchange the election. Either you had to go all in, or no, this was a great, outstanding election. After hearing 4 years ago that the election was stolen, right?
Well, I would push back on that. I think 4 years ago, there was a narrative in the Democratic Party that there was interference in terms of Russia doing things to advertise illegally for candidates in the United States. So, for instance, from the Mueller indictments, we got that there was an organization called the Internet Research Agency, I think, the IRA. And this was a front that had been established in the US that had backing from the Kremlin, that was obfuscated from the US government, from the State Department. And they were using this organization to kind of like pay people to do things or advertise certain things. So, insofar as that's concerned, I mean, that seems pretty incontrovertible. I don't know how many Republicans fight against this. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But in my opinion, I think that good evidence has been shown that that is the case. So, insofar as there's like some interference in the election, sure. I think in 2016, I think it's foregone. Now, whether votes changed, no, I don't think there's any evidence of that. But for the mainstream Democratic opinion, I don't think that was I don't think that was ever the case. That they were saying that, like, maybe some people did, but that wasn't the overwhelming narrative that the election was literally had votes stolen and votes rigged. And you look at like the difference in behavior. Hillary Clinton conceded that night. It's not like the Democrats are trying to challenge the election or saying that, like, oh, we think it was rigged, we need to go look in here and here. Like, they conceded. They were mad about Russian interference, but it was what it was, and then the politics continued as usual.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say the same thing about Russia interfering in the election as I would about voter fraud. I'm sure it happens every major election that they're doing something. So it's
Mhm.
the question is what is the degree in which they're doing it, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah, for
so,
sure. And then also for the Trump campaign, it was like, was there any sort of collaboration between anybody in Trump's campaign with the Russians? Would have been a big thing too. Yeah.
yeah, and so right. So, but let's unpack that for a second because that's a debate that we kind of, as society, kind of swept over. I mean, Hillary, Trump, whomever, insert candidate here, they all have large ties to very wealthy people and very high-ranking government officials around the world.
Mhm.
It would seem not possible for these presidential elections to happen, and these guys aren't calling in favors to various nations. Don't do this, hold off on this or whatever. To ask these things every 4 years, this I would imagine this is going on already.
Maybe to some extent, but like calling, foreign leaders and asking for dirt on candidates or making big asks, probably not in the wheelhouse of ordinary politician behavior, even if we hate politicians, or if it is, I haven't seen it expressed as much or discovered as much. Um,
Well,
but
okay.
I mean, it's possible it's happened. Yeah.
Let me ask you this.
Hmm.
So, and this is again, this is I'm just more generally speaking. If you're an establishment politician that's has good ends with the CIA, I'm sure you like, I mean, I think we've had plenty of documented cases where the CIA has, ran interference into the countries. They've done stuff. They bribed officials.
Hmm.
Leveraging some of those assets, I don't think is outside the realm. When you go back and look at the Cold War era, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, what those guys were doing. I mean, there was a ton of just crazy corruption that was going on, not just in the U.S. but abroad. And so, why we would think that stopped, I think, would be my thing. So I would say not necessarily about Trump or Clinton, just a
Hmm.
general sincere skepticism that what we're seeing is good, honest integrity from both parties.
Yeah, but I mean, I think we have to look at. There's two things we have to look at. One is there is a pre and post foreign policy of the United States from 1991, before and after, right? During the Cold War, we were obviously highly motivated to resist certain regime changes around the world that were moving in favor of communist governments or allegiance to the Soviet Union. And we were trying to roll people over to our side because there was kind of this like world war, the Cold War being fought, between this multipolar world with communism and capitalism against each other. So, I mean, in that sense, we definitely had that post 90s. I think our foreign policy was quite a bit different. I don't think we were as aggressively, obviously we have some blunders like Iraq. But I mean, we're not as aggressively like trying to tip things in other countries in the same ways that we were pre 91, pre fall of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. Also, another thing is when other countries are being interfered with, not that this makes it okay or acceptable, they tend to be like incredibly destabilized countries anyway, or these countries that are looking to external help for people to kind of like put their finger on the scale to change the power from one way or another. There's a big difference between the United States or Russia or Saudi Arabia, having interference in places like Syria or Yemen versus finding out that like the United States is trying to influence the elections in like France or Italy or Germany. That would be a really big deal. Or finding out that like the United Kingdom is trying to influence the elections of like even like Mexico or Canada. That would be a really big deal. So I think that just because we've seen some shady behavior or inappropriate behavior in the past, and just because we see modernly some sorts of like I'd say maybe inappropriate behavior in other countries in the present and destabilized countries, doesn't mean that we should expect to see these like big changes in elections across the world from one like sort of first world country to the other. I think that would be pretty unprecedented, or maybe not unprecedented, but there would be a lot of people that are like, what's going on here? Like, why is Australia trying to, funnel money illegally into New Zealand to elect a different leader? Or why is, like yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm with you there. I think. I guess for me, um, I think most Americans, when they're polled and they ask, and you might want to look it up, but there's a poll like, what percentage of Americans trust politicians? And it's like, 10, 20%. And I
Mhm.
always joke that they're thinking about the other guy. Like they're thinking about the
Of course.
Republican or the Democrat. Yeah, they're not thinking about their own person. And for me, it's better to sit from a position of a real skepticism that if this person is saying they want your vote, they are probably lying to try to convince you that they're going to do things that they're probably not necessarily motivated to do. They're more interested in the vote. And if you start this with a position of skepticism, then you hear these stories come out. It's like, yeah, that's actually within the realm, whether it's Pelosi or whether it's Trump or whether it's Hillary Clinton or Biden or whomever. And I don't think Americans have that skepticism, and that would be more of what I'd be pushing for.
Have the skepticism of what?
That both sides are equally corrupt or
Oh,
high levels of corruption. I think we look at, so if you're a Trump voter, you look at
mhm.
Hillary Clinton and go, "Oh, she's corrupt, lock her up. Biden stole the election." But Trump, it's all good. And if you're a Hillary voter, you go, "Oh man, Trump's the worst. Biden's
Oh,
great."
maybe, yeah. People are always selectively critical of people that they disagree with. Yeah, of course,
But but
unfortunately.
but should we push for a more skepticism of both parties is really what I'm getting at.
I think skepticism is good, but I think a fundamental mistrust of our institutions and saying that they failed us is bad. Skepticism is good because it keeps things honest. Mistrust of information or of institutions is bad because it means the collapse of society and you can't really function anymore. So yeah, it's hard to balance out that you should be critical of something, but accepting of its place in the world and the role that it has to play.
Why do you think mistrust of the institutions would be a collapse of society?
Once we come together as a large group of people, we can't really effectively govern ourselves. I can't make laws for other neighborhoods. I can't figure out what the policy should be on like river drinking water, upstream. I don't know what trade should look like between the states. At some point, we have to create these external institutions that embody the will of people across the country that enact that will in a way that allows us all to function. So we can all agree on what the regulations should be, on how dollars are spent, on what taxes should be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you start to undermine those institutions, what you do is you fundamentally disconnect from being able to affect society in a positive way. And then the other alternative actions that you have available to you all become dystopian. So, for example, if we look at like the criminal justice system, and you say, "I don't trust cops," that doesn't work. So, what's the prescription? Well, if you see anybody breaking into something, don't call the police, don't do anything. Well, okay, well now you've got people that are breaking into houses, people are too scared to call cops. Your criminal justice institution has failed. Well, now what happens? Vigilantism. People take matters into their own hands. That's not an ideal society. When you look at the voting booths, right? Well, you say that the polls have all been rigged and the votes have been rigged themselves. Like we can't even trust who's being voted for president. Well, now what do you need to do if you don't trust that the elections are legitimate? Well, I need to go storm the Capitol. I need to make my voice heard that this isn't right. It's like, okay, well, that's not good. If we don't trust our vote, then like people are going to start protesting elections. Not in that I don't like this guy, but then I don't think this guy is legitimately elected. So yeah, I think the faith that the institutions are functioning, even if we ought to be skeptical in them, is the most important cornerstone of a functioning democratic society. Because necessarily in a democracy, you're going to have a lot of people that really disagree with each other, and it's not functioning for all of these different people to be enacting all of their will in all their different areas. We have to have some codified general morality, codified general system that we all agree to work under, even if we don't like it at times, in order for the country to continue to function.
Yeah. So I think you're definitely right that if you erode complete mistrust of these institutions, you will see other problems. But the pushback I'd say is a lot of these institutions I don't think are necessarily interested in what's best for most Americans, because they are highly incentivized to work with big business and to do stuff in their interest. So how do you get a government organization that's not beholden to the voters to actually change how it's operating uh, to the best interest of the voters?
That goes into a whole other discussion, but I think that the government actually is beholden to the voters, pretty hardcore. I think that people make a couple mistakes when they look at how the government functions, where they assume it's all bought by big business. But I think that when you look at different policies across the board, that I used to believe this a lot. I actually used to be a Bernie Sanders supporter in 2016 because my most important issue for voting was getting rid of any form of like lobbying or getting rid of any form of like corporations being able to spend money on elections. I wanted all of that gone. Citizens United, all of that I thought was horrible. And I think it was actually a conservative that came on and he challenged me. And one of the questions he asked was, okay, so you believe that politicians are loyal to their true constituents, which are the corporations and the big donors. I was like, yeah, of course they are. Like, look how much money these guys spend on elections. And the second question, he said, so these guys are basically writing all the laws and they're getting passed what they want, even to the chagrin of the American people. Even if the American people don't want it, these corporations can write their own laws. I'm like, yeah, of course. Obviously, this is how the game is played. And then he asked me a really simple question, and I had no answer. He's like, can you give me an example of what is something that enjoys broad popular support in the United States, but it can't get passed because lobbyists or corporations are pushing against it? And immediately I wanted to say like 30 things, but I actually didn't have a single answer to any of that. I'm like, fuck. And I thought about this over the next few weeks and months, and I'm like, broadly speaking, if the American public wants something, it'll happen. It does happen. It might take a little bit sometimes. So there might be friction because of the Senate or because of the construction of the Supreme Court or because of the Electoral College when it comes to elect president, but it will happen. The idea that the American public wants one thing, but corporations can push against it and make it not happen, I don't think that actually plays out. I don't think there are any major policy positions where I can see that happening. I do think that there are probably some edge cases where, like, if we're going to talk about the amount of some add in some fuel, whether or not that's okay or not, where the American public doesn't have their eye on it, where corporations have an opportunity to step in and push. But I think largely speaking, I think the government actually represents the will and speaks of and by and for the American people. And I think when a lot of people look to our dysfunction of government right now, they're trying to look at the process. They're saying, well, what's wrong with it? Is the lobbying broken? Is the Senate broken? Is the Electoral College broken? Is the filibuster broken? Everybody wants to blame a process and say, this is why the government isn't working. But then when you turn your eyes from the government, which is supposed to express the will of the people, and then you look at the people and you see what, in my eyes, is a historic divide between left and right, where we are living in totally different epistemic realities. We don't see eye to eye on anything anymore. Then I look back at the government, I go, you know what? The government is supposed to represent the will of the people, and the people are divided like they've never been before. It kind of makes sense that the government's not doing much, or it feels like it's not representing us. It kind of makes sense that every side feels like the government is fucking them over because we have a legitimate divide in opinion in the United States.
Okay, so to your point about a wide, I think you said, what's a wide sweeping policy that most Americans agree on? I'm not sure there's many of those out there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the point, though, right? Yeah.
So yeah, but beyond that, I mean, I think, if you go back, if you look at how the Fed monetary system operates, and how much money these companies make by being a part of the Fed, and how they lend out money, and how that works, there's all kinds of things that are happening with big business that the average American didn't get in. But the other thing, like, look at Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and I haven't heard your stance on Ukraine, so I'm not sure where you're at on that issue. But we're constantly sending money over to Ukraine. Okay, well, if you think that's a worthy cause, then you're not upset about it. But if you go, I'm not entirely sure this is the best way to allocate resources, who is benefiting from that? Well, that is some of the largest businesses that are tied to lobbying in the United States, the defense contractors. And so, that would be just a simple example. One other example I'd give you is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Okay, and so that, are you familiar with that one?
The which one?
It's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
I'm not familiar now.
Yeah. So essentially, what that says is, as an American citizen, you can pay a bribe anywhere in the world to anyone. So if you're in pick country here, Nigeria, Venezuela, doesn't matter, and you pay a bribe to a local official, it's a felony in the United States.
Okay.
And so, to me, that is a easy example of a law that's passed that most Americans aren't, to your point, maybe aware of, but it shapes how international business is done. And it really lends itself to big business having a huge competitive advantage over someone like myself who operates a small business trying to work in these foreign countries. But you can't really see that because it's just the way the law is. And so people aren't familiar with, like, oh, okay, this is the way the law is. So I suspect, if you were to go through more laws, you might realize that more laws are shaped in a way that don't appear to be in favor of big
Well,
business.
wait. So you said that these laws make it so it's illegal to bribe?
Yeah.
Wait, how does that favor big business?
So what they'll do is they'll set up multiple corporations and they'll pay consulting fees, and so they set up these shell corporations inside these companies. I say shell corporations. Let me give you an example. Let's say me and you are wanting to go do a project in Brazil, right? And a local official wants a bribe. Well, for me and you to pay that bribe is a felony. But however, Exxon or whoever it might be, they will have a system through all their lawyers where they can set up multiple corporations or one or two off corporations, hire these people in, give them jobs. So they figure out exactly how to work around the system. Whereas me and you don't have the legal funding to go figure out
I
exactly
guess
around this. Because it's extremely expensive.
I mean, that might be the case to some extent, but I mean, like, there's always going to be a disproportionate amount of power depending on who has money and whatnot. Like, it's kind of hard to legislate that. Insofar as what you said earlier, this is like a common thing I hear. People will talk about how, like, why are we going to war in countries? Why are we doing things? It's because of the defense contractors. This is another thing where if you're trying to say that, like, people can have a disproportionate impact on our policies because of how much money they spend, I think that the defense contractor one is the easiest one to shoot down. Like, if you look at Boeing, this is a company that's worth not even $100 billion. If you look at Lockheed, this is a company that's worth like a little over $100 billion. I think Raytheon is the most. I think they're like $140 billion. Like the market capitalization of like all of our defense contractors combined is like 1/4 of like the size of Apple. And when we go into wars and economies get crazy around the world, things like our tech companies will suffer. If it was the case that people were just paying money to dictate foreign policy, like you would expect to see people like Zuckerberg and Bezos would be hiring fucking assassins to kill people that are running our private contractors because they'd be like, bro, we're not going to war, fucking our economy up. We're losing so much value. There's no way, right? Like I feel like if politicians were truly making foreign policy decisions, we would be the most peaceful country in the world if our corporations are paying for it. Because I think our companies broadly just want the world to be pretty stable, want us to be able to sell shit. And I know that everybody kind of like looks, really big-eyed. They're like, oh my God, like we want to sell missiles to other countries in the world. And it's like, I don't think we want to sell missiles to other countries in the world. I think we want to sell iPhones. I think we want to sell our tech. I think we want people ordering shit off Amazon. Like this is where all the money is being made. Rather than like looking at these military contractors who and thinking that like these guys who are pretty small fry compared to the size of our tech industry, rather than assuming those are the guys that are like running the world's foreign policy, I guess.
Oh, okay. So
Mhm.
let's take Apple versus Raytheon or whatever.
Mhm.
Raytheon has really one customer.
Mhm.
That's the United States of America. Like that's it. Like they're like when Russia was going to go to war, there is no military industrial complex the same way that there is in the U.S. The U.S. defense contractors are the main ones globally. So it's not as if they're having to compete with anybody else. So their market cap and how big they are is relative to the actual market available to them. And so the
Mhm.
U.S. controls who. So the U.S. is setting who enters that, which I'm sure Raytheon and those guys have conversations about, and then who they can sell to. So
Sure.
so they don't need a larger market cap. Whereas Apple is trying to sell an iPhone to everyone in the world,
Mhm.
and the barrier to entry to that is much lower. So I don't.
Well, what I'm saying is that like let's say that we're assuming why are we going to war in some country, and you go, well, it's because the private military contractors are like trying to bribe or pay off or lobby officials to do it. If that was the case, I would expect to see tech companies just lobbying the other direction, and then I would expect to see private military contractors not be able to compete because Apple or Facebook or Amazon is going to have 500 times the budget to sway foreign policy if we're really saying it's just a matter of buying, politicians, as opposed to these private military contractors that are like, almost shrimp in comparison, sometimes 1/10 the size of some of these other tech companies.
So your argument is that Apple, Facebook, etc., would just simply counter lobby for there not to be war.
If that was how easy it was, right? But I think the uncomfortable truth is I think a lot of these wars do get support from the American people sometimes, and I think people sometimes forget, but after 9/11, Bush could have went to war with any country in
Oh
the
yeah,
world and the American public would have supported him.
absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think let me clarify what I'm saying is I'm not sure that Raytheon CEO is calling up Ted Cruz or Pelosi going, hey, we gotta go to war. I'm
Mhm.
not saying that. I'm saying that they live in a world that disproportionately sways how they view things by who they are influenced by. Right. So they're talking to people that believe these type of things. If you look at the think tanks and all these groups and the PR pieces, like I'll give you an example. Someone sent this to me the other day. Let's see if I can pull it up because you like the articles. Someone sent this to me the other day about a Iran shipping oil illegally, and it's in the Wall Street Journal.
Mhm.
Did you happen to see the article? If not, I'll pull it up here.
No, I don't think so. No.
Okay. Yeah, and so the article is U.S. eyes sanctions against global network it believes is shipping Iranian oil. And so if you go through here and look at this article from the Wall Street Journal, nothing that they're reporting in here is really new. It's old news. Anyone that follows the oil and gas industry would have known about this. So I have a hard time believing that this is something new to the Wall Street Journal. What seems more likely is that someone in the Biden administration or whomever wanted this to be a story, and so they're making it a story.
I think that so this is something else I'll push back on. I think there's a fundamental miscommunication. Well, it's possible that certain stories could get leaked, but I don't think that there are administrations that are dictating what's getting written because
Yeah,
if
no, no,
we
no, no. Yeah, I'm not saying
okay,
that. I'm saying
okay,
like,
okay, sure, okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Hey, this is the big deal. Wall Street Journal reporter
Mhm,
or Bloomberg. I'm not picking on Wall Street Journal. Hey, this is a
mhm.
big deal. You should look at this. And then they write the story. It's like, well, anyone's been following this. This is not like this is an old story. Like there's nothing new here of substance. And so, yeah, yeah. I'm not saying that they're actually dictating
Sure,
what's being.
sure. Okay, okay.
But that does shape how the public views this because if you don't follow these stories, you might go, "Oh my gosh, these Iranians,
Mhm.
wow, they're illegally selling the oil," and "Oh my goodness gracious!" And so it makes it harder to deduce Is this really a news story, or is this more, I don't say propaganda, but a PR piece is being put out?
Yeah, maybe, possibly. I'd have to read the story, I guess, and check
Sure.
the
Yeah, yeah.
compare. Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's just talk about Ukraine for half a second.
Mhm.
You know, when the Ukraine story came out, obviously they were invaded by the Russians, so everyone's like, "Hey, Russia's bad." But I'm not sure the story about we're trying to save democracy in Ukraine is an accurate representation of what we're trying to do there. Oh, I mean, so like
I think
that was
well, I think what's happening is the United States is seen more or less still as the leader of the free world, and people look to the United States for guidance on foreign affairs. You have a historic in that for the past 30 years, kind of one of the rules of the world is you don't invade another country and take territory from them. That's just not anything that anybody does anymore. So Russia is invading Ukraine, undermining the sovereignty of the government because they're unhappy that a leader that they favored got deposed, and they're using a bunch of strange excuses to do it. And the ultimate goal is to strip away territory from a sovereign state that Russia in 91 had recognized as having the territory that it did. This began with Crimea in 2014, and now it's continuing with Donetsk and Luhansk and the Donbass. So with this happening, everybody's kind of looking at like, okay, well, it's a little bit strange that
Mhm.
countries are back to invading each other and stealing territory. So I think the idea is that the United States is kind of supposed to take point on showing that, like, okay, well, we don't accept this type of behavior. We are the leader, arguably the leader of NATO. People look to us as in terms of moral guidance and foreign policy guidance across the world, for better or for worse. So the question becomes, do you stand by and do you watch Russia invade a country and take away territory, or do you do everything you can up to the point of World War III and showing that you'll support other countries around the world, whether we're talking about supporting democracies or whether we're talking about supporting kind of the broad idea of the U.S. hegemony? I think this is what the battle in Ukraine is about. And in that case, I think the United States does have, given how things have gone down, I think the United States easily has the moral authority to function in Ukraine, right? Ukraine is being invaded by a foreign power that's trying to steal land from it under no good reason. It's not like they have a good reason to go in and start doing that. So yeah, I think I'm definitely in support of the United States and the Western world pouring money and weapons into Ukraine to help them fight off Russia.
Okay. So the question I would ask is that the European allies have supported Russia and allowed them to continue to grow their economy, which is relatively small, but have grown their economy over the past 10, 20 years by buying supplies for them. And so this is one of the things Trump was right about, was that the Europeans are buying their energy from Russia, and so they kind of made this deal with the devil. And now you're like, oh well, you know what? Hey, these are bad guys. And it's like, the Europeans have fueled the Russian economy to the point to allow them to potentially, stay where they are in the global scale. And so, do you put any fault on the Europeans for willingly trade partners with the Russians?
No, I mean, like under Yeltsin in the 90s, and I think even under Putin, like there were talks of, Russia potentially joining NATO at one point. After 9/11, the United States and Russia had a pretty friendly relationship when it came to sharing intel related to terrorist activities. I don't think it's the goal. Like there were questions before Ukraine for a long time of like, what even is the point of NATO? Why does NATO even need to exist? Like,
Oh yeah,
it seems like, the Soviet Union is gone. Seems nice to be in NATO because nobody will fuck with you, but like it feels a little bit aimless. Maybe we need to move on to a different type of suprastructure, intranational or international structures. But so in that sense, I don't think that like Europe shouldn't have been like, I'm not trading with Russia or doing anything. The goal is always to build bridges, and the goal is always to build these connections around the world, to be more globalized, to have these positive relationships. So I don't think it's a fault that they were trading with Russia. I think that's good. I think we want that to happen. Arguably, one of the scariest things about trying to cut Russia off from parts of SWIFT or trying to sanction Russia is the more they're cut off from Western economies, the more they're kind of incentivized to just do wacky shit, right? Like if somebody can say, hey, if you go and do wacky shit here, we're going to sanction the fuck out of you and we're not going to trade with you, then it's like, I don't know if I want to do it. But if Russia has its own complete Eurasian alliance, if they've got stuff working with China and they don't need anything from the West, well, now, they've kind of got more incentive. Like, you know what? I am going to do this. If you don't like it, what the fuck do I care? You can't punish me for it. So I think that pushing for greater integration of nation states across the world is always going to be a boon if you're looking for like more peaceful
yeah,
organizations, I
yeah.
guess. Yeah.
So we agree 100% there. I think what I'd point out is that that NATO is there to protect the Europeans from Russia, and so you're kind of like saying, "Hey, I want to do business with the mafia, but I need you to protect me from the mafia at the same time." And so it's kind of instead of going all in on the free trade aspect that you talked about, there was a free trade aspect. But oh, by the way, we need to expand the NATO borders constantly to protect us from Russia. And it's like, well, if you're afraid of Russia, then maybe you shouldn't do business with them. But if you think that doing business helps, then do business with them. I am in agreement that that is one way to open up these economies. But that's not the stance that the Europeans took. They wanted it from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of depends. I don't think that we necessarily saw Russia as adversarial after the 90s. Like, for whatever reason, the fall of the Soviet Union was incredibly peaceful. Russia did do a couple of fucky things on their borders or on other places, in Transnistria and in Georgia. But generally, I think we weren't trying to have a highly adversarial relationship. And NATO technically really shouldn't be a threat to Russia at all, because it's not like NATO countries are attacking Russia. And being in NATO should reduce the likelihood of any conflict. We literally have like a direct line from DC, from the White House to the Kremlin, from DC to Moscow, to make sure that there aren't going to be these crossing of troops, that you never have US troops firing on Russian troops. So, I mean, ideally, like, more countries being in NATO should be relatively peaceful for both sides, unless Russia is upset and wants to fuck with somebody. But, I mean, yeah, I don't know. We're watching all this play out now, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, just hope it stops.
Mhm,
That would be the best thing.
mhm.
What do you think is? You mentioned the split in the U.S. Do you think that's a bigger threat to the U.S. than external factors like China, Russia, etc.? Do you think the internal division is the biggest threat right now?
To us or to right
Yeah.
or
No. What is the biggest threat to the U.S.? Just asking that.
yeah, our internal division is really, really, really bad. Yeah, we're
And
becoming
so,
dysfunctional, or have already become dysfunctional. Yeah.
yeah, and so I was thinking about this the other day, because I'm kind of like you, like, man, it's really bad. And then I look back, I go, well, we did have a civil war. We had,
Mhm.
what's going on in the 60s and 70s. Do you think it's actually worse now, or is it just because that maybe we're a little bit younger that we view it as worse?
I want to say on one end we all suffer from kind of recentism, where we're thinking that, like, oh, it's the worst time ever. But I will say that there are unique forces that are working today with the internet that make things feel a little bit different than they were in the past. Like, we have the ability to divide ourselves now more than we ever have, to self-select for ideologies, to punish people for betraying an ideology. Like, we could do that because of the internet and social media in more effective ways than we ever could. And this is probably forcing more ideological purity on both sides in ways that's never happened. And that's probably a scary trend that I don't see reversing.
And I don't want to mislabel you. You would consider yourself a progressive, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So, do you think that kind of part of your role here as a progressive, talking to people who are non-progressives, is to kind of maybe not bridge the divide on the thought, but bridge the divide on the peacefulness in which we engage each other?
Both, I think. I think people are closer to each other than they realize. We just get so dug into different positions that, like, yeah, it ends up being crazy. Like,
Do
even
you?
on the abortion stuff, like, like, I feel like you could get most of the country to agree on being pro-choice in, like, the first and maybe some of the second trimester. Like, everybody maybe should be able to have an abortion up to 20 weeks. I could understand some people being on the right being upset about it, but I think there's a lot of moderate right-leaning people like, okay, fuck it. You want to abort a baby at 3 weeks. Okay, fine. Um, but then on the left side, like, we probably shouldn't be having abortions, at like month 8. That's a little bit fucking weird. Okay. You're pulling out like what looks like a fucking kid and you're chopping it out. Probably not a good thing. But, like, on both sides, we just see people screaming for the most they can get, right? Some people on the left, the loudest voices are as many abortions as you want, whenever you want, to whatever trimester. And then on the right, it's like, pro-life. And if the mother tries to have an abortion, we need to fucking kill her for attempted murder. And it's like, Jesus Christ. We lose the ability to have any sort of conversation in the middle. We can't make compromises. Yeah, everything's just like totally dysfunctional.
Where should abortion policy be determined? Who should? The federals, the state?
That's a complicated question. That there's a lot of legal arguments over
No, no,
over that.
not legally. I'm talking about
Mhm.
from your perspective, just aside from what the constitutional arguments might be.
It probably should be a federal level thing, because what we're ultimately talking about is whether or not we're murdering somebody, and if that's the case, it feels pretty federal. Although I say that, but in actuality, things like murder, like, these are state charges; these
State,
aren't federal
state.
charges. Um, Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that, I guess. Like, on when it comes to really big issues like this, I kind of like the idea of it being a federal thing. I do like the idea of states being able to try their own stuff as well. But when it comes to, like, really huge issues like this, I feel like we should all in the United States probably be on the same page about it.
Yeah, and see, I think that's part of the point I was making earlier about, I live in a very small rural county in Texas.
Hmm.
How this county would function compared to what San Francisco would function is going to be completely different, right?
Hmm.
The views, the morals, all that stuff. And so it seems hard to say that, hey, there are more people in San Francisco, exponentially more. Their policies should govern how we want to operate in this county here, or vice versa. And
Mhm.
so, I've often thought, is there a way to even go down to a more of a county level, to where it's inside the state, and then you can actually sway the votes quite more impactfully, because the local mayor, you can actually access where
Mhm.
we're at. And so, I've often wondered, maybe even instead of going up, why don't we go down?
Um, I mean, to some extent, it's nice to be able to have more influence and direct control of your local areas. Like that's where policing comes from. Policing is going to come from your cities, from your mayor. He's nominating your commissioner, your chief of police, and everything, or choosing. But on another end, integration is really nice. Arguably, one of the most successful reasons why, or one of the biggest reasons why the United States is so successful, something the European Union is trying to emulate, is the huge amount of integration that we have across the United States. If I drive from one state to another, I know that my car can drive legally on those roads. I
Mhm.
know that I can spend any dollar that I earn in Nebraska, I can spend in Arkansas. I have a rough idea of like what all the laws are. I know how to pay the taxes. Like everything is like pretty simple because of the unity that we have from state to state. If we start getting these incredibly different communities from one area to the next, we run into a lot of friction from one area to the next. Like you're gonna have cops set up trying to find people with drugs or fireworks at every state border. You're going to have like people not sure what's illegal in one area and what's legal in the other area. And even today that happens to some extent. Some bikers will complain that when they cross into certain states they have to wear a helmet or they don't or whatever. Or what gun I like fuck I moved from Nebraska to California and now I'm in Miami and I'm not even sure where I'm allowed to carry my Glock or any of my weapons or whatever. I don't know what's allowed or what's not allowed. Sometimes I got to look up all the different laws. So I think we should always push for greater integration in areas where it's not like these huge questions of like what's locally way different from one area to the next. But I'm generally a fan of integration, while understanding we have to be respectful that there are going to be differences in some communities with how they want to be policed or how they want their economies to run or something to some extent.
Yeah, so that's kind of a political integration. What about cultural appropriation? Because that seemed to be a big talking point over the past few years. You think that's something we should push for, against?
Cultural. Wait, what do you mean by that?
Cultural appropriation, which is, this society kind of has a history of doing things this way,
Mhm.
look, taste, feel, whatever. A different society, just pick, I'm a white man versus maybe someone from Asia, and so kind of how they're going to look, dress, cook
I
the
think
rest.
that I feel like we just let that play out as it does. Like culture always changes. That's been the history of the whole world. No culture can be frozen in time. Like, people move places, people watch TV shows, people get different types of food. Cultures are always going to be like changing. That's just something that happens. Yeah.
Okay, we got just a few minutes left here. Let me ask you this:
Mhm.
what is the worst thing? You said you're a progressive. What's the worst thing about progressives right now?
They're unimaginably intolerant towards people with different ideas.
And what's the genesis of that, do you think?
There's a whole system of like this concept of like the paradox of intolerance, that if you're tolerant of intolerant people, then it actually destroys a tolerant society. So they've kind of tricked themselves into thinking that they have a good, righteous reason to be intolerant of anybody that even diverts a little bit from opinion. Because if they do, then eventually they're going to be like killed or murdered or something. So
Okay, and so what's the conservatives? I guess would be the opposite. So what's the worst thing about the conservatives right now?
I would say that a lot of them are bordering on very fascist tendencies. The constant undermining of all of our institutions, saying that like there's a global elite that's trying to destroy the world, trying to say that like all of our institutions have failed and the only like salvation we have is through one politician. These types of things, the undermining of institutions, is something that really, really, really frightens me. And that's like the biggest issue that I have, I think, with the conservative movement right now is the obsession with Trump. And it is the bit like if Trump runs as an independent, like over half of conservatives will walk to that party and it would be over for the Republican Party. That obsession with Trump and the eschewing, I guess, of all the institutions is very worrisome to me.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think he's going to run as an independent?
I think he's going to run and win as a Republican. I don't think he'll run as an independent. The Republican Party won't let him do that. If it seems like it's coming down between him and somebody else, I think that the other guy will just step out because Trump will just Trump will run. He doesn't care about the Republican Party or the health of like he wants to be president again.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn, because he's going to have to walk back some of his vaccine stuff, because he was booed, or at least his position was booed. God, I don't know, 6 months, a year ago, whatever it was. He's talking about vaccines, and so I'm curious if he still has a read on his voter base like he did going into 2016. I think he lost some of that, but maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. Of course, and who do you want the left to run?
It has to be Biden again. You can't throw away your incumbent advantage. Like even if he's old, even if people don't like him as much, like probably better him than somebody else, I think. But
Do you think he can win?
Dude, our world is crazy. I would never even. I can't even predict like the House and Senate results right now. Like, who the fuck knows what'll happen in 2 years? The economy could go one way that would make it so that like Biden is super popular, or it could go another way and like, or another global disaster could break out, or who knows? Maybe in a year, all of us will be dying to monkeypox. So, yeah. Wait, hello. Oh, hello.
I think my internet cut for a second there.
Oh,
You there?
yeah. Did you get the end of that statement?
You said that you think it could go one way or another. Is what you said. I think.
Yeah, there could be another global catastrophe. Maybe we'll all be dying of monkeypox in a year. Who knows?
Okay. Well, where do you want to send people to? And you stream pretty regularly. What are your set times, or is it kind of day by day?
I should be streaming from noon EST to 10 p.m. EST every day I can. And then, yeah, you can find me at youtube.com/destiny.
Awesome. Well, thank you for this. I enjoyed it, and look forward to watching more of your streams. Oh, I did want to mention real quick. I watched your thing about the South African farmers with Laura Southern.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've been to South Africa several times. Got a lot of good friends down there. So this would be probably 6 years old information. The
Okay.
first time I went down there, we went to one of the on a safari, and there was a bunch of farmers. And if I remember the story correctly, they were talking about there's a disproportionate amount of farmers that are murdered because if you go to have you been to South Africa?
No.
Okay, so every house in the city is behind an 8 foot tall wall with like barbed wire or something like that. Well, if you go out
Mhm.
to the farms, they can't afford to put up the protection that they have, and so they're able to be targeted at a disproportionate rate because they're out there, they're kind of vulnerable. There's no cops, and
Mhm.
so it's more to it than that. But I did hear that, and it brought back those going past
Sure,
those
sure.
farms, and just kind of how they were being viewed as vulnerable. And I think at the time they had like a day of the year they'd come out and call for international support, like a protest or something. I don't know
Mhm.
if they still run that or not. But anyways, I caught that the other day and I thought that was a flashback to being down there a few years ago. So for what that's worth.
Gotcha, gotcha.
All right. Well,
Cool.
thank you for your time, brother. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, man.